The air was crisp and cool as Tom and I drove down the winding dirt road, our car packed with camping gear, food, and everything we'd need for a few nights away from civilization. The sun was already dipping low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the dense forest surrounding us. We'd planned this trip for weeks, both of us eager to escape the endless buzz of the city and sink into the quiet solitude of the wilderness. The spot we'd picked was in a secluded part of a national forest. Hardly anyone camped out here, too far off the main trails, too isolated. But that's exactly what made it perfect for us. A break from everything, just two friends under the stars. We parked the car in a small clearing and began unloading, working quickly to set up camp before darkness fell completely. The only sounds were the distant chirping of birds and the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. As we set up the tent and arranged our gear, I felt a sense of peace settle over me, the kind of relaxation that only comes from being truly removed from the world. But as I stood up to stretch, something caught my eye. In the trees just beyond the edge of our camp, there was a figure, a man, standing perfectly still, half hidden among the shadows. I stared, unsure if my eyes were playing tricks on me. He was far enough away that I couldn't make out his face, but close enough that I could see he was watching us. My skin prickled, a chill running down my spine. I nudged Tom, who turned and followed my gaze. He squinted, frowning as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. "Think he's just hiking?" Tom whispered, though his voice held a note of unease. "Maybe," I replied, though I didn't believe it. Something about the way he was standing, so still, so focused on us, felt wrong. The man didn't move, didn't call out, just stood there, watching. Finally, Tom and I decided to ignore him, reasoning that he would probably move along soon enough. But as we continued setting up camp, I couldn't shake the feeling of his gaze on us, like a cold weight pressing against my back. The sun dipped lower, casting the forest in shades of purple and blue. The man was gone now, or at least I couldn't see him anymore. But the unease lingered, sticking to me like a shadow as we started a small fire and settled down, trying to relax. We talked, laughed, and cooked over the fire, but every so often I'd catch Tom glancing over his shoulder, just as on edge as I was. The forest grew darker and the noises around us shifted. The chirping birds replaced by the hoots of owls, the occasional snap of a twig echoing through the stillness. We tried to convince ourselves that everything was fine, that it was just our minds playing tricks, but the eerie feeling only seemed to grow. Eventually, we both fell silent, the crackling of the fire the only sound between us. I was poking at the embers, lost in thought, when I felt it again, that prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like someone was watching us. I glanced up, scanning the shadows beyond the firelight, but saw nothing. Just darkness stretching out between the trees. Tom must have felt it too, because he muttered, "Maybe we should just head to bed early, huh?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The sooner we got into the tent, the better, I figured. The fire was dying down, casting long, flickering shadows around the campsite. As we crawled into the tent, I couldn't shake the nagging thought that we weren't alone out here, that something or someone was out there in the darkness, waiting. I lay in the tent, staring up at the dark fabric above me, listening to every sound. Tom's breathing beside me was slow, but I could tell he wasn't asleep either. We were both on edge, each creak and rustle from outside only heightening the tension in the small space. I closed my eyes, trying to will myself to relax, but the unsettling feeling of being watched refused to fade. At some point, exhaustion won, and I drifted into a restless sleep. But it didn't last. A snapping sound woke me, sharp, close, like someone stepping on a branch. My eyes flew open, my heart pounding as I listened, holding my breath to catch any movement outside the tent. Tom stirred beside me, muttering, "Did you hear that?" I nodded, even though he couldn't see me in the darkness. "Something's out there," I whispered, my voice barely audible. We stayed still, straining to listen, and that's when we heard it again. A shuffling, deliberate, as though someone was moving carefully around the campsite. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as the sound grew closer, circling around us, stopping now and then, only to resume a moment later. I could almost feel the presence outside, a silent menace that pressed against the thin walls of the tent. Tom shifted beside me, his hand brushing against mine as he whispered, "Maybe it's an animal?" I wanted to believe that, but I knew better. The footsteps were too heavy, too purposeful. Whoever or whatever was out there knew we were inside, and the way they moved, slow and unhurried, sent a chill through me. After what felt like an eternity, the sounds faded, retreating back into the darkness. I let out a shaky breath, realizing I'd been holding it, and glanced at Tom, who looked just as shaken as I felt. "We should leave," he whispered, barely audible. "First thing in the morning." I nodded, feeling a rush of relief at the thought of leaving, of getting away from whatever was lurking out there. But as I drifted into a fitful sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't going to be alone until then. Morning couldn't come fast enough. The first hint of dawn was a welcome sight, the pale light filtering through the trees, bringing a sense of safety. We packed up quickly, eager to get out of the forest. But when we reached the car, my stomach dropped. All 4 tires were slashed, the rubber shredded and useless. Tom cursed under his breath, pacing around the car as he inspected the damage. "This wasn't an accident," he muttered, a mix of anger and fear in his voice. "Someone did this on purpose." I looked around the clearing, half expecting to see that figure again, watching us from the shadows. The thought that he'd been out there while we slept, close enough to sabotage our car, made my skin crawl. Panic started to rise, and I felt the ground slipping beneath me. "What do we do now?" I asked, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. Tom rubbed the back of his neck, scanning the woods as if expecting the stranger to step out at any moment. "We can try to hike back to the main road. It's a few miles, but it's our best shot. If we stay here, who knows what he'll do next." With that plan in mind, we grabbed our essentials, leaving the rest of our gear behind. The forest, which had felt so serene the day before, now seemed hostile, each shadow hiding unknown threats. We kept glancing over our shoulders as we moved, the silence around us more oppressive than ever. The occasional rustle of leaves or snap of a twig would make us flinch, convinced that the stranger was following us. We hadn't made it far when we heard it. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, matching our pace from somewhere behind. Tom and I shared a look, a silent agreement to pick up our speed. The footsteps grew faster, echoing through the trees, urging us into a panicked run. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears as we ran, each step pushing us further from the campsite, from the car, and hopefully from whoever was stalking us. The path blurred beneath my feet as we sprinted, driven by the sheer terror of knowing we were being hunted, the sinister presence closing in with each passing second. Branches slapped at my face and my lungs burned as we tore through the forest, barely daring to look back. The footsteps behind us had grown fainter, but we didn't slow down, too terrified to stop in case he was still there, watching, waiting. My mind raced, replaying every chilling moment of the last night and morning. Whoever this man was, he didn't just want to scare us. He wanted us to feel trapped, hunted. Tom and I finally reached a small clearing, pausing to catch our breath, our ears straining for any sound of pursuit. The woods were silent now, an eerie calm that only heightened the sense of dread curling in my stomach. I could see the fear in Tom's eyes, mirroring my own thoughts. How close had he been? Was he still following us, hiding in the trees just out of sight? Tom nodded toward a narrow trail leading down the hill. "This should take us to the road," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Let's keep moving. We're too exposed here." I nodded, and we moved quickly, half jogging along the trail, our ears tuned to every noise. The silence around us was almost oppressive, the dense trees seeming to close in with each step. We hadn't gone far when we heard it again, soft, shuffling footsteps, closer than before, echoing through the underbrush behind us. It was as if he knew exactly where we'd go, following our every move. A cold dread spread through me, and without a word, we broke into a full sprint, the trail barely visible through the dense forest. We stumbled and tripped over roots and rocks, desperate to put distance between us and the relentless footsteps echoing behind. I felt like the forest itself was conspiring against us, each branch reaching out, each shadow stretching as if to pull us back. Suddenly, we burst onto a gravel road, the harsh sunlight blinding after the darkness of the woods. I looked around frantically, hoping for some sign of life, but the road was deserted. Tom and I slowed down, panting, our hands on our knees as we tried to catch our breath. For a moment, we both listened, our heads snapping back toward the trail, but the footsteps had stopped. The silence felt unnatural, almost as if the forest itself had gone quiet to watch us. I scanned the trees, half expecting to see the figure step out, but there was no one. The relief was overwhelming, though a part of me knew we weren't truly safe. What was that? I managed to gasp, my voice shaking. Tom shook his head, his face pale. I don't know, but he wanted us gone, that much is clear. I've never felt anything like that. It was like he was waiting for us. We didn't waste any more time. With no other option, we began walking down the road, hoping we'd eventually find someone who could help us. The miles passed slowly, each step a reminder of the terror we'd just escaped. The further we got from the forest, the easier it became to breathe, though neither of us dared to look back. We walked in silence, our minds replaying the nightmare we'd left behind. After what felt like hours, the sound of an approaching vehicle reached us. We flagged it down, waving our arms, relief washing over us as the car slowed to a stop. The driver, an older man with a kind face, took one look at our disheveled appearance and knew something was wrong. He asked no questions, just gestured for us to get in, and we didn't hesitate. As we drove away, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. Tom and I exchanged a glance, the same unspoken thought passing between us. We'd never know who that man was or what he truly wanted. But the fear he'd left behind was something neither of us would shake easily. After a long night at a Halloween party, I finally stumbled into my quiet, darkened house, still half-dressed in my costume. The streets outside were empty, the festive decorations in neighbors' yards turned off, leaving the suburban neighborhood in an almost eerie calm. The laughter and music from the party still echoed faintly in my head, and all I wanted was to sink into my bed and let sleep take over. I locked the door behind me, tossed my keys on the table, and kicked off my shoes, feeling the exhaustion settle deep in my bones. Halloween had always been one of my favorite nights of the year, with all the decorations, costumes, and harmless mischief in the air. The night had been fun, a perfect mix of scare and laughter, and I couldn't help but smile, remembering some of the crazy costumes my friends had come up with. As I got ready for bed, though, I couldn't shake a strange feeling. Maybe it was just the remnants of the night's spooky theme lingering in my mind, but something felt off. The house was darker and quieter than usual, and an odd tension hung in the air. I brushed it off, chalking it up to a mix of exhaustion and the spooky stories I'd heard earlier, and turned off the light, climbing into bed. I had barely drifted off when a loud, insistent knock jolted me awake. At first, I thought I'd imagined it. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, the remnants of sleep slipping away as my heart began to pound. Another series of knocks echoed through the house, slow and deliberate, coming from the front door. It was the middle of the night. No one I knew would be coming by now, especially not like this. I slipped out of bed, moving quietly down the hall toward the front door. Peering through the peephole, my stomach twisted as I caught sight of a figure standing there, just beyond the door. The person was still, face obscured by a disturbing, twisted mask that glinted faintly in the porch light. Whoever it was stood unnervingly still, the mask hiding any expression, making them look almost inhuman. I froze, a wave of fear washing over me. My immediate thought was that it was some late-night prank, a leftover Halloween prankster who'd lost track of time. But something about the figure's stance felt too intentional, too patient, as if he were waiting for something, waiting for me to open the door. Then, a faint sound behind me made me turn. A quiet, almost imperceptible click near the back of the house, like a window being nudged open. My pulse quickened as I realized the horrifying truth. The masked figure at the door wasn't alone. They were trying to lure me to the front while someone else was attempting to break in from the back. My mind raced. I couldn't decide whether to confront the figure at the door or check the back of the house, but I knew that standing still wasn't an option. Taking a deep breath, I turned and moved quickly toward the kitchen where the sound had come from. I felt like I was in a horror movie, each step filled with dread, the shadows around me seeming to deepen as I approached the back window. As I reached the kitchen, I saw it. A second figure, also masked, crouched outside the back door, fingers gripping the edge of the window, slowly trying to pry it open. My heart thundered in my chest, and I backed away, adrenaline flooding my system. The masked intruder hadn't noticed me yet, focused on the lock, and I knew I had only seconds to act. I fumbled for my phone, trying to keep my hands steady as I dialed 911. The phone felt slippery in my sweaty hands as I frantically dialed 911, my heart racing as the figure outside continued to pry at the window, oblivious to my presence. The operator picked up almost immediately, her voice calm and professional, but I could barely speak above a whisper, terrified that the slightest sound might alert the intruders. "Someone's trying to break into my house," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "There's one person at the front door, another at the back. They're both wearing masks." The operator's voice softened, a practiced calmness that barely reached me through the haze of fear. "Stay on the line with me. Help is on the way. Do you have a safe place you can hide until the police arrive?" My mind raced, trying to think. The thought of hiding felt like torture. I didn't want to lose sight of them. I felt a sickening need to know where they were, to be prepared if they managed to break in before help arrived. But I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. I'll try," I whispered, still unable to look away from the figure outside. The man at the back door gave one final tug on the window, and I heard the faint pop of the lock giving way. My breath caught, and I stumbled back, clutching the phone to my ear as I watched him slowly lift the window open. In the faint glow of the streetlight spilling into the kitchen, I could make out the edges of his mask, an eerie, twisted smile frozen on a pale, lifeless face. The operator's voice continued in my ear, trying to keep me calm, but it felt distant, muffled under the sound of my own heartbeat. "Stay with me," she repeated gently. "The officers are almost there." Just then, another loud knock echoed from the front door, this time more insistent, as if the person out there knew what was happening at the back and was trying to distract me. My stomach twisted as I realized how coordinated this all seemed. This wasn't some random Halloween prank. It was planned, deliberate. The intruder at the back had nearly hoisted himself inside, one leg already swinging over the windowsill. I backed away slowly, desperate to put some distance between us, but terrified that if I turned my back, he'd lunge at me. I needed a weapon, something, anything to defend myself if he got any closer. My hand fell to a heavy ceramic bowl on the kitchen counter, and I gripped it tightly, my knuckles white as I prepared to swing if necessary. Every second felt like an eternity. My eyes locked on the intruder as he slowly eased himself through the window, his head finally ducking under the frame. Then, suddenly, the sound of sirens pierced the quiet night. Faint at first, but growing louder, approaching fast. The intruder froze, his head snapping up as he registered the noise. His eyes met mine for a split second, a flicker of surprise breaking through the blank, lifeless mask. Without a word, he pulled himself back through the window, disappearing into the darkness outside. The knocks at the front door stopped, and I heard hurried footsteps fading away. I backed against the wall, feeling a mix of relief and terror, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I waited for the police to arrive. When the flashing red and blue lights finally illuminated my front yard, I nearly collapsed from the weight of everything. The officers arrived quickly, moving through the house and checking every window, every room before confirming that the intruders were gone. But the fear didn't leave with them. It stayed. A lingering chill that clung to me even as they assured me the area was safe. One of the officers took my statement, his expression sympathetic as I described the masks, the coordinated attempts to break in. "It's probably kids pulling a prank," he said, though I could see a hint of doubt in his eyes. "But we'll keep an eye on the area, just in case." I nodded, though I knew it wasn't just a prank. The officers stayed a while longer, making sure every door and window was securely locked before they left. I stood by the doorway, watching the red and blue lights recede into the distance, feeling an emptiness settle over me as the street returned to silence. The house felt different now, stripped of its usual comfort, the shadows suddenly deeper, more ominous. I locked the door behind them, double-checking every lock and latch, though it felt more like a ritual than a reassurance. My mind kept replaying those moments, the masked figure at the door, the stranger easing himself through the back window, the quiet, calculated way they'd moved, as though it were all a twisted game. I shivered, trying to shake off the memory, but the fear clung to me, a chill I couldn't shake. Sleep was out of the question. I wandered through the house, turning on lights as I went, illuminating every corner, banishing any shadow that might hold a trace of the night's terror. The kitchen felt especially eerie, with the window they tried to open and the small scuff marks left by the intruder's shoes. I stared at the marks, half expecting to see them move, as though he might still be lurking just beyond my line of sight. Eventually, I settled in the living room, wrapped in a blanket with the television on low, hoping the noise would bring me some comfort. The hours dragged on, each creak of the house setting my nerves on edge, my mind conjuring images of masked faces just outside, watching, waiting for the right moment to return. I knew they were gone, but the fear lingered, leaving me in a constant state of vigilance. As dawn broke, a soft gray light filled the room, washing away some of the shadows, but not the unease. I hadn't slept at all, and every sound, every rustle outside made me flinch. Halloween had always been my favorite night, a time of harmless scares and laughter, but now it felt tainted. The sense of security I'd once felt in my own home, shattered. Later that morning, I got a call from the police. They hadn't found the intruders, but would increase patrols in the area. I thanked them, but the reassurance felt hollow. I knew that the true impact of the night would linger far longer than any police patrol. It wasn't just about them breaking in, it was about the feeling they'd left behind, the fear that had seeped into my walls, making every shadow seem threatening. The next few nights, I barely slept. Even after Halloween had come and gone, the memories haunted me. I found myself jumping at every noise, peering through windows before going to bed, and double-checking each lock before I could convince myself it was safe. Each Halloween decoration in the neighborhood felt like a reminder, each mask a sinister echo of that night. Eventually, the decorations came down and the days grew colder, but the unease never fully left. I knew that next Halloween, and maybe every Halloween after that, I would remember those masked faces at my door, their silent patience, the threat they'd brought into my home. And though I tried to push the thoughts away, I couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't just been a random scare. Halloween had become a time of unease, a night I'd once loved, now marred by fear. And as I locked my door each night, a part of me knew I would never fully trust the silence again. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was the only sound breaking the silence as I paced the small convenience store inside the gas station. The clock on the wall ticked slowly toward midnight, marking the long, empty hours of my shift. Working the night shift had its perks: fewer customers, minimal supervision, and time to organize the shelves or watch the occasional late-night movie on my phone. But there were nights when the quiet was overwhelming, making me hyper-aware of every creak and flicker. Tonight felt different, though. A strange sense of unease had settled over me as soon as the sun went down. The roads had been oddly quiet, and only a handful of cars had passed by since my shift started. I tried to brush it off, but the feeling persisted, clinging to me like a shadow. Around 11, I noticed them. 3 figures lingering on the edge of the gas station's parking lot, just far enough away to be shrouded in darkness. I squinted, trying to make out their faces, but they were obscured by what looked like masks. Maybe costumes, judging by their exaggerated shapes. Halloween was over, and it seemed strange for anyone to still be in costume. My first thought was that they were teenagers up to no good, but there was something unnerving about the way they stood there, completely still, facing the store. I busied myself behind the counter, hoping they'd just move along. I glanced out the window every few minutes, but they hadn't moved. They were just watching, standing as still as statues, silhouetted against the faint glow of the streetlights. My hands felt clammy, and I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong, that they were waiting for something, or someone. Minutes ticked by, each one dragging slower than the last. I tried to focus on anything else, filling the coffee machines, straightening up the racks, but their presence was impossible to ignore. When I looked up again, one of them had moved closer, just a few steps forward. My heart skipped a beat as I realized they were inching toward the store in slow, deliberate movements, like they were testing how close they could get. I took a shaky breath, forcing myself to keep calm. "It's just a prank," I muttered under my breath, trying to convince myself. Kids trying to get a rise out of me. But deep down, I didn't believe it. There was a calculated calmness to the way they moved, a sense of intent that went beyond a simple Halloween prank. Finally, unable to take the tension any longer, I picked up my phone and dialed the non-emergency line for the local police. I explained the situation, feeling a bit embarrassed as I described the three costumed figures standing in the shadows. "Probably just some kids," the dispatcher said, trying to reassure me. "But we'll send someone by to check it out." I hung up, feeling a bit more at ease, though the discomfort lingered. I tried to ignore them, focusing on my work and avoiding the windows, but a strange thumping noise caught my attention. I looked up to see one of them pressing his hand flat against the glass door, his mask tilted slightly as if peering in. The mask was grotesque, a twisted, exaggerated grin stretched across it, painted in unnatural colors that gleamed under the harsh lights. My stomach twisted as he pressed harder against the door, his fingers splaying across the glass. The others remained in the parking lot, watching with the same eerie stillness, as if waiting for a signal. I backed away, feeling trapped, every instinct screaming at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The man with the twisted grin mask kept his hand on the glass, pressing harder with each passing second, as if testing the strength of the door. I stood frozen behind the counter, feeling like a deer caught in headlights, unable to look away. His head tilted to the side as if he were sizing me up, his gaze, hidden behind the mask, boring into me. My skin prickled with unease and a cold sweat beaded on my forehead. I glanced around, desperate for something that could be used as a weapon, my mind racing with half-formed plans. But before I could move, the door handle rattled and I felt my stomach drop. The man tugged on it, his fingers curling around the metal, testing it with a strange patience that only made him seem more menacing. I held my breath, waiting, hoping the door would hold. Finally, he released the handle, his hand dropping back to his side. But he didn't step away. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step back, joining the other two figures who had edged closer to the building. They stood side by side now, their masks catching the faint light and casting long, distorted shadows across the pavement. It was like watching characters in a nightmare, each one waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I forced myself to move, inching back toward the stockroom, hoping to put some distance between us. My phone was still in my hand, and I considered calling the police again, this time to report something more serious. But before I could dial, the lights inside the store flickered. I glanced up, heart pounding as the fluorescent lights buzzed and dimmed, casting everything in a faint, eerie glow before returning to full brightness. The brief darkness seemed to embolden the figures outside. I saw them exchange glances, then, without warning, one of them strode toward the side entrance. Panic clawed at my chest as I realized what they were doing. One was trying to draw me to the front, while the others attempted to get in through the side door. I couldn't cover both doors at once, and I knew if I left one unguarded, they'd get inside. I glanced at the cameras, hoping they were still capturing everything, but with the flickering lights, I wasn't sure if they were even recording. With no other choice, I darted toward the side door, praying I could lock it before they got too close. My shoes squeaked against the linoleum as I slid to a stop, twisting the lock into place just as a shadow fell over the glass. Another masked figure pressed his face close, his eyes hidden behind dark, hollow sockets that seemed to absorb the light. His gloved hands tapped rhythmically on the glass, a slow, unsettling rhythm that echoed through the quiet store. "Come on, man," I muttered to myself, gripping the lock with white-knuckled hands. I couldn't tell if he could see me clearly, but it felt like his gaze was piercing right through me, dissecting me with each calculated tap. My stomach twisted, and I fought the urge to look away, terrified that if I broke eye contact, he'd take it as permission to break through. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the tapping stopped. He stood there for a moment longer, then took a step back, glancing over his shoulder at the others. I took a shaky breath, hoping this was over, that maybe I'd scared them off. But as I watched, the three of them exchanged nods, moving as if in silent agreement. The man at the side door gripped the handle, giving it a final shake before letting go, and in one coordinated movement, they all turned and disappeared into the shadows outside. I backed away slowly, my entire body on high alert, but the sudden silence felt even more unnerving than their presence had been. Just as I considered moving toward the phone to call the police again, the sound of approaching footsteps filled the parking lot, followed by the unmistakable flash of red and blue lights. A wave of relief washed over me as a patrol car pulled up, the officer stepping out with a cautious expression. The officer's flashlight swept across the parking lot, illuminating the dark, empty space where the masked men had stood just moments before. I rushed to the front door, fumbling with the keys to unlock it, feeling a mix of relief and dread as I stepped out to greet him. The officer looked at me, his brow furrowing as he took in my disheveled appearance and the panicked look on my face. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with concern. I took a shaky breath, trying to steady myself. There were three men, I stammered, glancing around as if they might reappear at any second. They were wearing masks, trying to get inside. One of them almost got through the side door. The officer nodded, his hand resting on his holstered weapon as he scanned the area. "Can you show me where they were?" he asked. I led him around the building, pointing out where the men had stood, where they'd pressed their faces against the glass, their fingers tapping rhythmically, almost mockingly. As we walked, the officer shined his flashlight along the ground, examining the footprints left in the dirt outside the windows and doors. I could see his jaw clench slightly, his expression hardening as he took in the details. "They didn't say anything?" he asked, looking up at me with a serious expression. "No," I replied, swallowing hard. "They just stared and tapped on the glass, like they were waiting for something." The memory of their masks, twisted, grotesque expressions frozen in place, sent a fresh wave of unease through me. The officer nodded, his gaze shifting back to the store. "We've had a few reports about masked figures in the area recently. Some people saw them around local neighborhoods, trying to lure kids over with candy. We're not sure what they're up to, but it seems they've been targeting quiet spots, places where they won't be disturbed." The thought chilled me to the core. I'd assumed they were just trying to scare me, maybe a Halloween prank taken too far, but this was something else entirely, something darker. I imagined them lurking around neighborhoods, standing in the shadows, waiting for children to come close. My stomach turned, and I felt a deep sense of dread at what their intentions might have been. The officer took my statement, asking for a description of each mask, every small detail I could remember. I recounted everything, the twisted grin on the mask pressed against the front door, the hollow eyes that seemed to watch me from the side. As I spoke, I felt a chill creeping back over me. The memory of those faces burned into my mind. When he was finished, the officer gave me a reassuring nod. "We'll increase patrols in the area," he promised, "and I'd recommend keeping your doors locked and staying vigilant, especially at night. These men seem to be trying to scare people, but it's better to be safe." I thanked him, though the reassurance felt thin, like a weak shield against the threat that lurked just beyond the edges of the light. As he got into his patrol car and drove away, the emptiness of the parking lot closed in around me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, watching from the shadows, waiting for the next opportunity. The rest of the shift passed in tense silence. Every creak, every flicker of the lights set my nerves on edge, and I found myself glancing toward the windows, half expecting to see those masked faces staring back at me. I knew I'd never forget this night, the sense of helplessness that had crept over me as I watched them move like shadows around the store. When dawn finally broke, I locked up the store with trembling hands, stepping out into the pale morning light, feeling like I'd emerged from a nightmare. But even as I walked to my car, I couldn't shake the lingering fear, the haunting knowledge that those masked figures were still out there, somewhere in the quiet streets of our town, waiting for their next move. Driving through the Alaskan wilderness at night was an experience I'd dreamed about for years. The sheer isolation, the sense of freedom, and the beauty of the rugged, snow-capped mountains surrounding me was all I'd hoped for. My trailer hummed along the desolate road, cutting through the darkness like a single point of light in an endless sea of night. The road stretched on, empty and quiet, disappearing into the shadows ahead. I hadn't seen another vehicle in hours, and with each passing mile, the world behind me felt further and further away. There was something deeply satisfying about being so completely alone out here, with only the vast, untouched landscape and the stars above as company. I planned to pull over soon, find a spot to sleep, and continue the journey at dawn. The silence was absolute, broken only by the low hum of the trailer and the occasional whistle of the wind against the windows. But as the night grew colder, I began to feel a strange unease, a faint prickling sensation at the back of my neck. The road felt too quiet, almost as if something were waiting in the darkness just beyond the reach of my headlights. I brushed it off, reasoning that I was simply adjusting to the isolation. I found a small clearing by the side of the road and pulled over, parking the trailer under a cluster of tall pines. The trees cast long, dark shadows that blended into the night, swallowing any light from the trailer's small lamps. I turned off the engine, and the sudden stillness was almost unnerving, like I'd cut myself off from the rest of the world entirely. I locked the doors out of habit, chuckling at myself for the precaution in the middle of nowhere, and settled into bed, wrapping myself in a thick blanket against the chill. But sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept replaying the empty road, the long shadows of the trees, and that strange sensation of being watched. I rolled over, willing myself to relax, but every creak of the trailer felt louder, every gust of wind sharper, like the night itself was pressing in on me. I finally drifted off, lulled by the soft sound of the wind, my body heavy with exhaustion. A loud knock jolted me awake. My heart thudded in my chest as I sat up, disoriented, straining to make sense of the noise. Another knock echoed through the trailer, this time more insistent. I glanced at my watch. It was well past midnight. The last thing I'd expected was company out here, and my pulse quickened as I realized how isolated I was. I reached over, carefully pulling back the edge of the curtain just enough to peek outside. My breath caught. Standing just outside, partially illuminated by the trailer's exterior light, were three men. They wore thick coats and hats, their faces partially obscured by the shadows, but I could see the glint of their eyes, fixed intently on the trailer. One of them raised a hand and knocked again, harder this time, his gaze never leaving the window. "Hey!" one of them called, his voice muffled but calm, almost too calm. "Can you help us out? We need some assistance." My mind raced. I couldn't think of a reason why anyone would be out here, especially this late. The men didn't look panicked or in distress, just waiting. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay calm. Maybe they were hunters, I reasoned. Maybe they'd broken down and were looking for help. But something in the way they stood there, watching the trailer in silence, didn't sit right. I cleared my throat, trying to sound steady. "What do you need?" The man closest to the door took a step forward, his face still hidden in shadow. "Just open up. We need to come inside." That was all it took to set off every alarm bell in my head. I froze, every instinct in my body screaming not to open that door. The way he said it, so calm, so sure of himself, felt wrong, like he was certain I'd do exactly what he asked. I gripped the edge of the blanket, steadying my hands as I kept my eyes on the shadowy figures outside, my mind racing for a plan. The man knocked again, louder this time, as if sensing my hesitation. "Come on, just open up," he repeated, his tone almost coaxing, as if I were a child needing reassurance. Behind him, the other two men shifted in the darkness, their faces barely visible, but I could feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to think rationally. "Sorry, I can't do that," I called back, hoping my voice sounded firmer than I felt. "If you need help, I can call someone for you." There was a pause, a silence so heavy I could almost hear my own heartbeat. The man's head tilted slightly, as if considering my words. "We don't need a call," he replied finally, his voice colder, more insistent. "We just need you to let us in." I didn't respond, hoping they'd take the hint and leave. But instead, one of the other men moved closer, stepping into the light, revealing a face half hidden by a hood, his expression blank and unreadable. He looked at the first man, then back at the trailer, as if they were having some unspoken conversation. I glanced around the small space, my options limited. I could try to start the engine and drive off, but that would mean getting out of bed and into the driver's seat. Too much time, too much movement. I felt trapped, cornered, with nowhere to go but deeper into the dark, desolate Alaskan wilderness. The isolation that had once felt so liberating now felt like a cage, the weight of my solitude pressing down on me. Another knock, more urgent this time. "Come on, don't make this difficult," the first man said, his voice losing its calm edge. "We just want a little help. Let us in." I tried to keep my breathing steady, my mind grasping for a way out. But before I could respond, a flicker of movement caught my eye, further back, beyond the reach of the trailer's light. My stomach twisted as I realized there were more of them, lurking in the shadows, their figures barely visible but unmistakable. This wasn't just 3 men looking for help. There was a group of them, all waiting in the darkness, silent and patient. My chest tightened as the realization sunk in. They'd surrounded me, cut off every escape route. Whatever they wanted, it wasn't anything good. Desperation took hold, and I scrambled to the front of the trailer, pulling back the curtain just enough to check the road ahead. It was empty, stretching on into the darkness. My only option was to drive. I could hear them at the door, rattling the handle now, testing it, as if they knew I was trying to think of a way out. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, then lunged for the driver's seat, shoving the keys into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I glanced back to see the men freezing in place, their heads snapping up to watch me. One of them pounded on the door, a sharp, violent sound that jolted me into action. I shifted into gear, pressing down on the accelerator, the tires skidding slightly on the gravel as I lurched forward. In the rearview mirror, I saw them scattering, their dark forms retreating into the night. But as I sped down the road, a horrifying thought gripped me. They hadn't run in fear. They'd moved with purpose, slipping back into the shadows as if letting me go was part of the plan. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, my foot pressed down hard on the gas pedal. The trailer lurched and rattled as I sped along the rough, deserted road, the dark Alaskan wilderness closing in around me. My eyes flicked between the road ahead and the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those men, those figures, pursuing me through the night. But all I saw was darkness stretching endlessly behind me. I kept driving, my mind racing with fragmented thoughts and fears. Who were they? What did they want? The calmness in their voices, the way they stood there so confident and patient, had unsettled me deeply. It wasn't desperation. They had wanted something more than just help. Whatever their intentions, I had no desire to find out. The road seemed to twist and turn forever, each shadowed curve only deepening my sense of dread. The night pressed in around the trailer, the silence broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional gust of wind. My heart hadn't slowed, the adrenaline keeping me hyper alert to every sound, every flicker of movement outside the windows. After what felt like an eternity, a faint glow appeared up ahead. I realized with relief that I was approaching the main highway. The road was still isolated, but it was more likely to lead me to safety, away from the narrow, shadowed paths I'd been traveling. The thought of reaching civilization, of seeing other people, filled me with a flicker of hope. As I merged onto the highway, I allowed myself a moment to breathe, loosening my grip on the wheel. The fear still lingered, but the vast openness of the road was a relief after the claustrophobic shadows that had seemed to close in around me back there. I drove a few miles further, putting as much distance as possible between me and that dark road before finally pulling over to the side. I sat there in the dim light of the dashboard, trying to calm my nerves, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. The men were gone. I was sure of that, but their presence felt like a stain, a weight that refused to lift. I'd never encountered anything like that before. There had been a quiet menace in the way they'd surrounded the trailer, like they were toying with me, testing my reactions. Just as I was beginning to settle, I caught movement in the corner of my eye, a faint shape in the darkness beyond the road. My heart leapt, and I held my breath, staring out into the night. but when I looked closer, there was nothing, just empty road and silent trees swaying in the breeze. It took me a while to convince myself to keep driving, but the thought of staying still, even on the main highway, was unbearable. I needed distance, a sense of escape from whatever I just encountered. As I continued down the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the men I'd left behind in the wilderness hadn't truly gone away. The rest of the night passed in a tense haze, every shadow and flicker of movement keeping me on edge. By the time I reached the next town, the sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. I pulled into a gas station, stepping out into the cool morning air, the relief of being around other people a balm to my nerves. Inside, the attendant gave me a curious look as I paid for gas. "Long night?" he asked, his tone light but friendly. I managed a shaky nod. You could say that. As I drove away from the gas station, the town coming to life around me, I felt a strange mixture of relief and unease. I'd escaped, but the encounter would haunt me, that nightmarish scene playing over and over in my mind. The quiet persistence of those men, the way they'd seemed so certain I would open the door, left me with a chilling realization. They had been waiting for someone like me, someone alone, isolated, with nowhere to turn. And as I put miles between myself and that dark, lonely road, I knew I'd never look at the wilderness the same way again. When I first moved into the house, it felt like a dream come true. A cozy old home tucked away in a quiet suburban neighborhood, surrounded by big trees and a peaceful silence. The house had character, with its creaky wooden floors and the scent of old wood that lingered in the air. I'd always wanted a place with a bit of history, something with personality, and this house delivered that in spades. The only part that unnerved me slightly was the basement. The door leading down to it was at the end of a long hallway, and the stairwell seemed to descend endlessly into darkness. I hadn't spent much time down there. During the move, I'd only been down once, just long enough to stash some boxes and old furniture I didn't need. Dust hung thick in the air, and every sound seemed amplified, as if the basement walls held onto every noise, echoing them back with a sense of weight. At first, life in the house was as calm as I'd imagined. My evenings were filled with quiet solitude, and the house felt welcoming, if not a bit creaky. Every now and then, I'd hear a few soft groans from the floorboards or walls, but I chalked it up to the age of the house. Houses settle, especially older ones. Besides, it was comforting in its own way, like the house was breathing alongside me, reminding me of its age and history. But then, as the nights passed, I began to notice something that didn't quite fit. It was subtle at first, an extra creak here or there, a slight echo that seemed to come from the basement when I was sure I hadn't been down there. One night, as I was getting ready to sleep, I heard what sounded like faint footsteps. I told myself it was probably just the house adjusting to the temperature, or perhaps an animal outside. But there was something deliberate about the sound, something that sounded like real steps. Curiosity got the better of me, and I went to check the door to the basement. It was closed exactly as I'd left it, and locked from my side. I felt a sense of relief, convincing myself that my mind was simply playing tricks on me. But that didn't stop the uneasy feeling from lingering, creeping back each night when the house grew quiet. A few nights later, just as I was drifting off, the sound returned. This time, the footsteps were more distinct, heavy and deliberate, moving slowly as if someone or something was walking around down there. My heart started pounding as I sat up, straining to listen, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The noise would stop, then start again, as if whoever was down there was pacing, each step punctuated by a soft thud that echoed up through the floorboards. I tried to ignore it, turning on the TV to drown out the noise, but it persisted, each step growing louder in my mind. I barely slept that night, haunted by the thought of someone or something down in that dark basement. The next morning, I woke up groggy, the memories of the previous night hanging over me like a shadow. I told myself that I'd overreacted, that the footsteps I'd heard were just my mind playing tricks. Still, the uneasy feeling lingered, nagging at me every time I glanced down the hallway toward the basement door. I tried to convince myself to leave it alone, to avoid the basement altogether, but something inside me needed answers. After a full day of debating with myself, I finally gathered the courage to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, I walked slowly down the hall and unlocked the basement door, feeling a chill as I grasped the handle. The stairwell stretched below, swallowed by darkness, and a thin layer of dust lined the steps. I took a deep breath, gripping the flashlight tighter as I descended, each creak of the old wood amplifying my apprehension. When I reached the bottom, the basement was colder than I'd remembered, and a strange stillness filled the air, thick and almost suffocating. The light from the flashlight cut through the dimness, casting eerie shadows across the walls and over the abandoned boxes and furniture. I scanned the space, my heart racing, half expecting to see someone, or something, lurking in the shadows. As I moved the beam across the floor, I froze. In the dust, faint but unmistakable, were footprints. They were scattered around, leading from one end of the basement to the other, forming a pattern that suggested movement, as if someone had been pacing. I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach, my mind racing as I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. No one else had a key to my house, and I hadn't been down here in weeks. The prints were too clear to be old. They looked recent, undisturbed except for the small particles of dust caught in their edges. I tried to follow the path of the footprints, tracking them as they wound around the boxes and toward the far corner of the basement. The air seemed colder there, almost oppressively so, and the light from my flashlight flickered slightly, casting erratic shadows that made the room feel smaller. I took a step closer, leaning in to examine the prints, hoping for some logical explanation, but all I felt was an overwhelming urge to leave. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to get out of there before something, whatever it was, revealed itself. Heart pounding, I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight as I turned and bolted up the stairs. I slammed the basement door shut, twisting the lock, my breathing coming in short, frantic bursts. I leaned against the door, trying to calm down, but the sight of those footprints was etched in my mind. Each step a reminder that something or someone had been down there, walking around in my basement. I didn't know what to do. The idea of calling the police seemed absurd. What would I even tell them? That I'd heard footsteps and found some footprints in the dust? They'd think I was crazy, or worse, that I'd imagined the whole thing. And yet, as the silence settled around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that whatever had left those prints was still lurking somewhere close. That night, I barely slept. Every creak, every distant sound sent a jolt of fear through me. The walls seemed to close in, the darkness thicker than usual, as if the house itself were hiding something from me. I lay awake, listening, waiting for the footsteps to return, convinced that they would start up again as soon as I dared to close my eyes. The following day, exhaustion weighed heavily on me, but I couldn't ignore what I'd seen in the basement. I knew that whatever had left those footprints wasn't a figment of my imagination, and the thought of staying in the house without answers was unbearable. After pacing the living room for what felt like hours, I finally decided to call the police. I tried to keep my voice steady as I explained the situation, though I knew it sounded absurd. Footsteps, dust, strange sounds. The dispatcher reassured me that they'd send an officer over to take a look. When the officers arrived, I led them to the basement door, my nerves frayed as I unlocked it. They moved cautiously down the stairs, flashlights sweeping across the room, casting long shadows over the dusty floor. I followed them, my heart pounding as they examined the area, searching for any sign of an intruder. One of the officers stopped, crouching down to inspect the footprints. "These do look fresh," he muttered, his gaze serious as he looked around. He glanced at the other officer, who nodded, his expression unreadable. They searched every corner, every dusty box, but found no evidence of anyone hiding down there. After a thorough inspection, they turned to me, their faces a mix of concern and confusion. "There's no sign of forced entry," one of them said gently, "and there's nowhere for someone to hide down here. Are you sure you haven't been down here recently?" I shook my head, frustration and fear bubbling up inside me. I know what I heard, and those footprints, they weren't there before. The officers exchanged a glance, and one of them put a hand on my shoulder. "We understand, sir. It could be the house settling or the wind creating strange noises. Old houses tend to have a lot of quirks. Their explanation felt hollow, but I nodded, forcing a weak smile as they reassured me that everything seemed secure. They gave me a card and advised me to call if anything else unusual happened. I thanked them and led them out, but as I locked the door behind them, a cold emptiness settled over me. Their visit hadn't brought any comfort. If anything, it had only deepened my unease. The house was silent once again, but it felt different now, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for nightfall. I tried to go about my day, distracting myself with chores, but the memory of those footprints haunted me. The house's warmth and charm were gone, replaced by an oppressive feeling that weighed on every room, every shadow. When night finally came, I found myself dreading the quiet. I moved through the house, double-checking every lock, leaving lights on in each room, as if the light could somehow keep the unknown at bay. I lay in bed, wide awake, straining to hear anything out of the ordinary. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint rustle, set my heart racing, reminding me of the sounds I'd heard before. Sometime past midnight, I heard it again, the faint, deliberate sound of footsteps, this time slower, more measured, as if they were aware of my listening. My body froze, my breath catching as I gripped the sheets, too afraid to move. The footsteps echoed up from the basement, creeping closer to the base of the stairs, frantic, then stopping, as if whoever, or whatever, was down there knew I was waiting. The silence stretched thick and suffocating, until finally the footsteps faded, retreating into the depths of the basement. I lay there, my mind racing with questions and fear, unable to shake the feeling that something was down there, watching, waiting. When morning came, I decided I couldn't stay another night. The police had found nothing, but I knew what I'd heard, what I'd seen. The house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a stranger, a place holding on to secrets I wasn't meant to uncover. As I packed my bags, I glanced one last time at the basement door, a shiver running through me as I remembered those footprints in the dust. I locked the door behind me, stepping out into the light, leaving the house and its secrets behind. But even as I drove away, I couldn't shake the lingering chill, the feeling that whatever had been lurking in that basement would still be there, hidden in the shadows, waiting for someone else to find its silent, uninvited steps.